Welcome everyone to Using Portraiture to Teach the Struggle for Justice with the National Portrait Gallery's own Briana Zavadil White. In order to chat, please use the live chat on the right-hand side. We're going to get started in just about a minute, so just know that you're in the right place. All right, welcome again. Like I said, we are here for Using Portraiture to Teach the Struggle for Justice. We've got a guest presenter, Briana Zavadil White from the National Portrait Gallery, who's an educator there, and she's going to teach us some strategies alongside some of the portraits in the National Portrait Gallery's collection. In order to chat and ask questions, please use the live chat on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll need a Google account to be able to sign in. This is a session that was sponsored by the Smithsonian Learning Lab. It's also the second in a series of 3 Google Hangouts that are supported by the Grable Foundation. The Grable Foundation offers funding for a workshop series in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we've worked with about 30 U.S. history high school teachers, librarians, and media specialists. Today this is based on some of the interests of this group, but if you're joining us from anywhere else, welcome. We're excited to have you here. Like I said, to ask questions, it'll just be on the right-hand side. You can ask questions of our presenter, make comments about other peers' comments, as well as ask any questions of your colleagues as well. So without further ado, I'd like to get started and introduce Briana Zavadil White.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Briana, and I manage the student and teacher programs for the National Portrait Gallery. And I want to spend about 45 or so minutes today talking about how it is that we read portraiture and how we can use portraiture in our social studies classroom, our ELA classroom, and other classrooms as well. But in order to do that, let's take a step back and we'll talk a little bit about the mission of the Portrait Gallery. So the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery's mission is really to tell the story of America through the people who have shaped it. And so when you walk into our museum, the people that are hanging on the walls or sitting on pedestals in portraits are those people that we very often see in history textbooks, have biographies written about them, so on and so forth. And so today, with this idea of reading portraiture, I want to think about how we can use the art as a springboard into a conversation about biography and history. And those 3 words are really important because the Portrait Gallery considers itself to be a museum of these 3 disciplines, of art, of biography. Within the education department, we're always thinking about how we can look closely at the portraits to learn about the life of our sitter and to learn about the era in which that person lived. So when we think about reading portraiture, there are 10 elements, 10 visual elements that we need to start with. And so the first question that I want to pose to the group today, if you could go back, to pose to the group today is, if you are looking at this portrait of Rosa Parks and you want to learn the story behind the portrait, what are the visual elements, the visual clues that are in this portrait that we have to tease out, that we have to talk about if we want to tell the story of this image?
Great. So up on the screen, Briana has introduced our first portrait. And she's asking really what types of elements of portrayal would we need to Using the live chat on the right, you can answer this question. Just kind of think through how you might start to look or analyze this portrait, and what are those types of elements of portrayal that would need to be included. So one of the first things that comes to mind for me is the expressions on their faces. It's a pretty solemn portrait, I would say. Also, Kate H. from Pittsburgh says that she would look at the clothing they're wearing, the elements of the man's uniform, which also gives some clues, I think, about the time period as well.
Absolutely. And the other thing that clothing tells us, and Kate alluded to this, is that we can discuss time period based on clothing, but we can also discuss people's occupations based on what they're wearing. Clothing also can signify someone's economic status or social status as well. And there are some portraits where we can think about somebody's culture. We can think about their beliefs, their attitudes based on what they're wearing. And as you said, Ashley, when we look at the expression here, this is a wonderful piece because it is not just of one person, but we have two people. So when we think about their expression, even though they are both looking down at the task at hand, they are both thoughtful in what's going on. We also do need to consider the connection between these two people and how they're posed together and what their pose and their expression together are saying about this scene.
Sure. We also have someone else who said the setting. So where are they? Was a question that one of our colleagues had mentioned in the chat.
Right. And as you look closely at this image, you can see a pendant light behind our figure of Rosa Parks. And then sort of to the left of, or to our right, there is a phone. And then over on the other side of the police officer, you see lockers. And just at the top of the locker, there is perhaps a helmet. Perhaps it's something else. And so the setting that we see, while it doesn't expressly say that they're in a police station, we're getting other clues that give us that idea, but this setting helps us determine the location where this portrait is created.
Great. So you might have to give the audience that's watching some more hints about what we should be looking for. So far, I think we mentioned expression, we mentioned setting, what they're wearing, their clothing.
Right. And to go along with clothing, when we're thinking about our figures, we should also consider hairstyle too. And I think that hairstyle is one of those visual elements that is often overlooked. But I think that we can safely say when we look at this portrait, these are not necessarily hairstyles that we see today. And so it helps us date the image. In addition, we have to consider objects. And because this is more of, it's an editorial image, it was run in a newspaper, objects are not going to be the same as if you were looking at a formal portrait of an individual that was commissioned. But the really significant object within this portrait is the fingerprinting that is happening. So you see the paper on the counter, you also see the pad of ink. And then again, going back to the pose of our figures, we actually have the action of Rosa Parks being fingerprinted as well. So as you are continuing to look and you are thinking about the fact that this is Rosa Parks and she is being fingerprinted, and it's helping us determine the date in which this portrait was created. The other clues within this piece that help us think about time period are color, or in this case, lack of color, because we are looking at a black and white photograph. And so I know that We certainly use more color photography now, and we definitely use black and white photography now. But if you're thinking about 1950s United States, we had more black and white photography then, or only black and white photography then. Also, the fact that this is a photograph. So we need to consider medium when we look at portraiture. And so at the Portrait Gallery, we collect photographs, we collect paintings and sculpture, prints and drawings, time-based media art, which we call TBMA. It is anything that requires a plug, mixed media. So we think about portraiture in a variety of media. And I think that very often people only think of portraits as being oil paintings, but that is definitely not the case. And actually, photographs make up the greatest portion of our collection now. So if we move on to the next slide, we can look at those elements of portrayal. And as I said, there are 10 of them. And I think that we've covered all of them except for 2. And these 2 are the hardest, I think, when we're talking about this particular image. With scale, you really need to be looking at the artwork in the museum setting. So this piece is probably a foot by a foot. It's not very large, but we don't have that idea for scale when we look at it via PowerPoint on Google Hangout on YouTube. We can consider scale, though, within the artwork. So how much space are our figures taking up? And why is the artist choosing to portray them in this way? And then we also have to consider artistic style as well. And this is really important when we're thinking about 20th and into 21st century portraiture. And as I said before, with a piece like this, it is editorial in nature. It ran in the New York Times. It was covered. It was taken by an Associated Press photographer. So it has a different purpose. And so we aren't necessarily thinking about artistic style when we think of lighting and style of brushstrokes and things like that. But we do need to consider the why behind the artist creating the piece. Okay, so these elements of portrayal, they make up really the foundation of everything that we're going to do for the remainder of our time together this afternoon. These elements are all of the things that you can tease out, that you can pull out if you want to tell the story of a portrait. Now, it is certainly true that some elements are more important for specific objects, while other elements are important for different objects. So you have to be aware of the image and what is involved in it to decide what route you want to go down as far as what objects or what elements you want to highlight in your inquiry with students. Okay, so let's move on to the next image, which is one of my favorites in the museum. And with this piece, I want to introduce you to a strategy. And over the next few portraits that we're going to take a look at, we're going to take a look at different strategies that you can use when looking at portraits. And I want you to also remember, and this is really important, that the strategies that I introduce you to today, you can certainly use with other artwork as well. So perhaps it's a landscape, or maybe it's a historical painting, or perhaps it's even an artifact. You can still use these strategies across the board, okay? But what they do allow for is a close look and a slow look at these specific images. So this first strategy, which was created by Harvard's Project Zero and is an artful thinking routine, and we'll provide the link at the end of our session, is called Claim Support Question. And it's 3 simple questions, but it asks students to really think deeply about the image. So the series goes something like this. You make a claim about your topic, and you make a claim based on what you see. And then you identify support for your claim. And that support comes from 2 places. It comes from your entrance narrative, which is your prior knowledge, or the support comes from, again, what you see. And then from there, you ask a question that's related to your initial claim. Okay, so claim support question. And while you are looking at this piece, I would also in the Learning Lab website to do a search for signs. And what you can do is you can look very, very closely. Learning Lab allows you to zoom in. So if you don't do it now, you can do it after our session, because all of the images we'll be using today will be in a Learning Lab collection. So let's first start off with making a claim about this piece. What can we say based on what we see within this portrait?
Great. So using the live chat on the right-hand side of your screen, feel free to throw out some ideas, thinking about how you might make a claim about the specific topic. Oh, great. So Barbara says, I can claim that this is all about the 60s. So what do we think? Make a claim about your topic. Barbara says, all about the 60s.
So what is the support for that claim? What visual evidence do we have that tells us it's all about the 60s?
Okay. So feel free, anyone. We don't want to just put Barbara on the spot, so anyone can be a good friend and jump into. One of the things I personally noticed right away was kind of the two profiles of Kennedy brothers, which kind of helps date it a little bit. Anyone else have any other things that kind of support that claim as far as it's all about the 60s? Tessa also agrees with Barbara. She thinks because she sees Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and the moon landing. Again, Kate says the Kennedys, the astronaut. I think that's also perhaps Janis Joplin in the back.
It is. It is.
Okay, so we've got, it seems like some politicians or kind of political figures, as well as kind of entertainment. We also have, oh great, Kevin says he looked at the people themselves. So again, probably using some of those elements of portrayal that we just talked about. How quickly I forgot about those. But all of those are kind of signs to help us be able to support Barbara's claim. Oh yeah, Barbara says Janis Joplin, the Vietnam War as well. And Nicole also says that the image highlights people who represent important ideas and events from the 1960s. So we're kind of expanding our claim just a little bit more as we start to look at each of these elements.
Excellent. And so then we've talked about claims, we've talked about the supports for those claims. Now, think about a question related to your claim or a question that you have about this particular portrait.
Okay, so again, using the chat, you can think about specific questions related to this topic. One question I think I have is how the artist chose all of these very different styles. You know, it looks to me like it's a collage of sorts. Mm-hmm. And so all of these pieces seem to have kind of different emotions that are evoked from them. You know, I see Janis Joplin kind of in the back screaming or scream singing perhaps. Yeah, it's very interesting. Kevin also says, why are these people in particular used? Barbara says she was in high school at this time, so perhaps that dates her too. And why did the artist choose these specific events, these specific people? Maybe thinking also about the artist's point of view when it was made. Is this, you know, a nostalgic piece perhaps?
Right. So when I think about questions related to this work, it goes back to the ideas that have already been stated. Why do we see Buzz Aldrin, Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Janis Joplin within this piece? And why are they paired with these other scenes that we see, not necessarily of people that we know from history, but of scenes related to the 1960s? So why the pairing of people from history that are famous, that we know, that were making significant contributions that are in our history textbooks, with these other scenes from this particular era.
We also had just another comment too. Kevin mentioned most of the people in this picture died tragically, am I right? Well, except Buzz Aldrin, he says. And so making that connection kind of to prior knowledge as he recognizes some of the iconic figures in the portrait.
Right, right. And I think really another wonderful question to go along with this piece is, what is the artist's purpose, right? And I think that we've already said that. And so if we go to the next slide, we can take a look at what Robert Rauschenberg said about this portrait signs. And he said that he hoped that it would remind us of the love, terror, and violence of the last 10 years, and that the danger lies in forgetting. And so when we think about purpose, I think that this quote is a nice way to sum up what Rauschenberg was hoping people would see as they viewed this piece. But I can tell you that if you are studying the 1960s in your classroom, this is a wonderful place to start, and it's a wonderful place to end. And I've heard from teachers over the years that one of the extension activities that they would want to do with their students is to have their students take the past 10 years of their life and create their own collage of what this past decade would be for them. Because obviously this is Rauschenberg's interpretation of the 1960s for him, right? And what we remember.
Right. We have some more comments too, actually. So Nicole mentioned, why is MLK positioned in this way in the image is kind of one of her wonderings or questions. And then also Barbara mentioned, she's wondering who those people are that are just below Bobby Kennedy. And Barbara also says, where's the love? And I think one of the things you mentioned too that was interesting was as you pulled up this current slide, I noticed that it's in 1970, so it's just kind of right at the end of the 60s, but
yes,
on to the beginning of a new decade. And so I think the quote just fits so nicely with that.
Yeah, and just to answer a couple of those questions, Martin Luther King is actually in his casket in this image. And then just below Robert Kennedy is our soldiers. And then if you look at the bottom right, you'll see a very small snippet of the Zapruder film, which is the film that recorded the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And then up in the top left and the top right, it looks like a candlelight vigil, and then a peaceful protest on the right. And then again, in the top left, just below the candlelight vigil, you have more soldiers. And I think that is a really interesting question that Barbara posed, which is, where do we see the love here? And I think that's a question that you ask your students as a way for them to interpret this piece. Okay. All right, let's move on to our next image. This is a actually detailed portrait that I would encourage you after our session to go into Learning Lab to zoom in on, because really you have to get into each of the squares to see each of those details. And I'd like to introduce you to another artful thinking routine, Think, Puzzle, Explore, which in a lot of ways is similar to claim, support, question, but we think about the questions a little bit differently. So here it is, what do you think that you know about this artwork or this topic? And then based on that, what questions do you have? And from there, what does the artwork or the topic make you want to explore? What would you want to do next to learn more about what's going on in this image?
Great. So again, in the live chat, you can answer some of Briana's questions. She's introducing the Think, Puzzle, Explore strategy to us with this artwork. So feel free in the chat to share some responses. So the first piece is, what do you think you know about this artwork or topic? And that's where we'll start, right, Briana?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. And as you're looking, pay close attention, because there are words within this portrait, and they provide us with some clues as to who the individuals are that are represented.
So Kevin says, is this a mosaic?
It is very much, it's very much like a mosaic. The entire portrait is made up of individual squares. And within the squares, there are faces.
So I personally noticed the word Cesar in the bottom left, which after you had told me that there were words that I could see, then I started to look for some of the other ones. So it looks like those are also names of the people that are portrayed here. We also have a comment. I think this portrait depicts Hispanic leaders, because I see Dolores Huerta in the lower right. Mm-hmm. So someone knew exactly who she was. And then this looks like something related to Chicano civil rights movement. I'm not totally sure who exactly the people are, besides that they might be Hispanic or Latin American.
Okay. And absolutely, we do have Dolores Huerta in the bottom right. And then, as Ashley said, in the bottom left, we see Cesar. And so above that, we have an image of Cesar Chavez. He is the bottom left image. And they were, of course, contemporaries.
Thinking back to the elements of portrayal, I know facial hair wasn't necessarily one of our elements, but I'm noticing the person in the middle has kind of a very, to me, looks but like it's not quite of the same era of Dolores or Cesar.
Right, absolutely. And this individual was alive in the early part of the 20th century, so very early on.
To people's faces, I'm also noticing kind of right above his head, it looks like some type of, maybe it's a national bird or some form that's right above him that seems symbolic.
Right, and has anybody noticed, or has anybody seen this bird or this symbol before?
We don't have an answer to that question just yet, but maybe people are thinking. But right now, someone mentioned too that she was going to say that she doesn't remember all of the history, but the other figures look like other Latin American leaders or heroes. Someone said Hidalgo.
Yep. So in the top left and the top right, we have representations of Hidalgo and Morelos. They were both leaders during Mexico's war for independence in the early part of the 19th century. And Ashley, as you said, with our central figure and his facial hair, that is Emiliano Zapata. And he was a Mexican revolutionary, and he was fighting for agrarian reform during the early part of the 20th century. And Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, of course, were part of the United Farm Workers movement of the 1960s and the 1970s, where they were trying to gain reform and gain rights for migrant farm workers. And so as we look at this piece, we see these three different eras within history, three different generations of social justice activists. And I think that the question that I posed at Signs previously really is the same here, which is, okay, well, what is the artist's purpose in creating a portrait such as this? And if we move on to the next slide, this piece was created in 2005. and it's called The Return to Aslan. And Aslan is the mythical home to the Aztec people, and it's also considered the cultural realm for Mexico. So all of these individuals have a tie to Mexico. And specifically, when we look at the eagle in the top center, that eagle is not only on the Mexican flag, but is also the symbol for the United Farm Workers, which again was founded by Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And I think one of the really great puzzles about this piece goes back to the gridding or the patterning that we were talking about initially. When you are able to zoom in, I want you to pay special attention to each of the squares. And each of those squares is a stylized Aztec face that makes up this entire image. So not only do we have these portraits of these 5 individuals, but then we also have all of these repeated faces that, again, are giving us this view of the background of all of these people, where they have come from, and who and what they are fighting for. All right, let's move on to the next one. Okay.
This is one of our favorites, for sure.
And it is absolutely one of my favorites too. And I think with this piece, I want to explain a little bit about the Unveiling Stories global thinking routine, and then take us to our next slide in just a minute. But Unveiling Stories, the idea behind it is to build our students' global competence. And it's a series of 5 questions. And so the questions, as you can see up on the screen, are what's the story? And what's the story is really about the overall theme of the artwork, which winds up being a little bit different than the next question, which is what's the human story? And so when we think about the human story, we're thinking about what's going on with the people in this artwork. What are they doing? Where are they going? What can be said about them? And from there, we're considering the world story. So how are we placing these people in a much larger context? What is this portrait's sort of place in the world, and how is it relevant to what's going on today? What's the new story actually becomes really important when we move on to our next slide. And if we can go to that next slide, I will show you that the piece that you see is based, the piece in the upper right-hand corner is based from a portrait that was created many, many years ago called Washington Crossing the Delaware by Emanuel Loitza. It's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And the piece that hangs in the portrait gallery is called Shima Mora Crossing the Delaware, which hangs in our museum and only dates from just 7 years ago. And if we can go back to the full image, the very last question is, thank you, is what's the untold story? And the idea behind this question is, what are we not seeing? As well as what's happening beyond the frame? So as you look at this portrait and you're thinking about all these questions, what are you noticing about this artwork?
So again, using the live chat on the right-hand side, start to think about and maybe just throw in the chat some of your ideas as far as what you're noticing about this artwork. I loved the comparison slide too, to be able to see kind of the traditional image of Washington crossing the Delaware that some of us might have even seen in history books, to seeing this one that is very much similar, but there are certainly elements that I think kind of cause you to stop and think and explore a little bit further.
And if you go to the next slide, and so we can have Shima Mora and Washington crossing the Delaware up at the same time. As Ashley said, there are a lot of similarities. When people see Shima Mora crossing the Delaware, they automatically say that certainly it is based from Washington crossing the Delaware. But the closer you look, I think the more differences we begin to see.
Mentioned in the notice that the main figure is wearing an outfit that looks similar to Washington and Washington crossing the Delaware, but the other figures are wearing what looks like traditional Japanese clothing, question mark?
Exactly. And it is, you know, like I said, it's wonderful to compare the individuals within these two pieces. So in Shima Mora crossing the Delaware, all of the individuals in the boat with Shima Mora are samurai warriors, and they are wearing traditional robes that note their family. And so when you look closely, you can see different symbols on each of their robes, which, if you think about it, is very different from Washington crossing the Delaware, because all of those men that are in Washington's boat are dressed very similarly, and they are all in unison. There is a consistent path that they are trying to get across the Delaware River. But with Shima Mora crossing the Delaware, it looks like there's confusion on the boat. And there are a lot of different expressions that we are seeing with all of these individuals that are in this boat.
It's interesting too, someone just mentioned, I'm noticing the Japanese painting style, but obviously echoing this famous American moment and topic. And for me, those waves looked very familiar, perhaps kind of Hokusai waves.
Absolutely. That is absolutely what they are based off of. I'm glad that somebody mentioned that.
And then also kind of in the chat, there's a comment that says the different style of art along with having different characters in the painting as well.
Yes, and when you look at the style, this is actually one of those really great points where we can talk about the artistic style, that element of portrayal from the beginning. Washington crossing the Delaware, this is very much a 19th century way of depicting a scene like this, a historical painting. And the Washington crossing the Delaware is a very large image in the Met. And then when you look at Shima Mora crossing the Delaware, it is more contemporary, and yet it is referencing artwork that has come before. And it is Roger Shima Mora's signature style to create his works very much in this way, almost comic-like or cartoonish. The colors, you can tell, are very different than Washington crossing the Delaware. Yeah. Anything else that we notice? Any other answers to the 5 questions for Unveiling Stories within this piece?
So again, those questions are, what's the story? What's the human story? What's the world story? What's the new story? And what's the untold story? I found it pretty interesting that once you revealed the name of the portrait as well as who the artist was, that he put himself in this painting as kind of the lead figure.
Right, and so when an artist is creating a self-portrait, and he's using work from art history to create that image, we always have to question the why of it. Again, this idea of purpose, and I'm seeing this as our through line in today's Google Hangout. We have to consider the artist's purpose in creating this work. And so Roger Shima Mora is 3rd generation Japanese American. He was obviously born here in the United States, but when he was just 2 years old, his family was taken to Idaho and placed in a Japanese internment camp during World War II. And I think that very much, that experience set the stage for his artwork to come. And so he is certainly making a commentary on his own Japanese American identity. But he's also saying something by placing himself in the role of Washington. And so what do you all think that he's trying to say by placing himself in the role of George Washington, father of our country, first president, and in this particular portrait of Washington crossing the Delaware, placing himself in the role of Washington here versus in other images of Washington?
So one of the comments that we've seen is that the image definitely evokes immigration or migration stories to one of our attendees. Also that the expressions of the men in the boat look confused or upset. So what are they thinking? And then finally, Barbara also mentioned she's wondering if they are in need of a leader. They look like they're in a hurry, paddling away from something and looking back.
Right, absolutely. And this idea of immigration definitely gets to our world story and how this image is relevant to us today and what's going on. I think that taking a look at Shima Mora, looking out at all of us, versus Washington, who is looking in the direction that the boat is moving, is an interesting contrast. And so he is looking out at the viewer. He is looking out at the audience. Definitely not as focused on thinking about having all of these men in the boat with him all on the same page to get across their body of water. So again, a very different feel.
One of our attendees also was wondering, did they miss what year this was painted? And we just switched back up on the screen. So this specific painting was 2010, right?
Right, exactly. And with this piece, I think it's really interesting too, with Shima Mora crossing the Delaware, is that, so they're not actually crossing the Delaware River, which I think we probably all have recognized. But this body of water that we're seeing is meant to represent San Francisco Harbor. And that upper left-hand corner is meant to represent Angel Island, which is the processing center for Asian immigrants, or was the processing center for Asian immigrants. And so I think that that also plays into how we're reading this particular image. For certain, you can spend a lot of time with your students with this particular portrait. There are many layers to this artwork, and I think that that's why the Unveiling Stories thinking routine works so well. But honestly, claim support question works equally well with this image. But I would encourage you, if you are going to use it with your students, that you slow down with them, take some time, because there are a lot of questions that come out of a work like this. And a piece as complex as this one needs time to really sit down and think about it. So let's move on to our next piece. The truth is that I couldn't decide which image to show you because I love them both. And so I decided that we were going to take a look at both of them looking at posters and how we analyze posters. Because I think that we analyze posters a little bit differently than we might analyze other artworks. So before we dive into looking at Dory Miller and Leonard Crodog, I will just say that the Portrait Gallery very much considers posters such as these portraits. And so we have made a concerted effort over the past few decades to collect posters in our collection. And I think one of about posters that you should consider if you're going to use them is that posters are ephemera. They weren't meant to withstand the test of time. They are a piece of paper that is mass produced to get an image out there or an idea out there for propaganda, but they weren't meant to stick around. And so that's why I think posters are so great, because at the Portrait Gallery, our earliest poster is the broadside. It's the $100,000 reward poster after Lincoln's assassination. And, we have very recent posters as well, the fine arts version of Obama's campaign poster with hope at the bottom. But these two particular posters fit so nicely into the idea of the struggle for justice that I wanted to show them to you all. And so when we're analyzing posters, we have to think about the colors that are being used, symbols, what is the message, who's the audience. It's very often that we consider audience when we look at other portraits. And then finally, purpose. Along with who's going to see it, where is it going to be seen, and the idea of, is it going to motivate people to do something, or what's it going to get people to do? So we have two posters up here. Feel free in the chat box to add your thoughts on either one of these images related to the ideas of color, symbol, message, audience, or purpose. And you can see who they are, along with when these posters were created. But if you have an idea to why they were created, you can add that into the chat box.
So Above and Beyond the Call of Duty on the left-hand side with Dory Miller looks like perhaps something to do with the Navy. I see in the bottom left, if I squint nice and hard, something about Pearl Harbor. And Kevin asks, I'm having a little bit of trouble reading the wording. Does it say Medicine Man under Crow Dog?
It does. So for Leonard Crow Dog, Medicine Man, and then underneath it says We Are Still Here. And then at the very bottom right, it is signed by the artist Paul Davis with a copyright of 1977. And then with Dory Miller, Above and Beyond the Call of Duty, that was the title of the poster. We call it Dory Miller because all of our artworks, well, most of our artworks are named after are titled the name of the sitter. And then at the bottom left of the Dory Miller poster, it says that he was awarded the Naval Cross, the Navy Cross, for his actions at Pearl Harbor. And the date on it is May 27th, 1942.
One thing I noticed right away in the Leonard Crow Dog poster is his gaze. And, it seems to me that honestly, when you're looking up, it's kind of more of a hopeful expression, perhaps.
Right, and I think that goes along so nicely with the fact that it says We Are Still Here. On the poster itself. We have to consider perspective too when we're looking at Leonard Crow Dog, because he's looking up, but the way that he's positioned within this poster, it's almost as if we are looking up at him. Whereas when you look at Dory Miller, we are eye to eye with him, because again, this idea of perspective. And I was thinking as I was reading what both of these posters say, it's really important to note too that most posters, especially propaganda posters and rights posters, really from, I would say, World War I through the Civil Rights Movement, many of these posters are going to have words on them. And those words are so important because they wind up being clues. So for posters, we can add that really as our 11th element of portrayal. These words are there for a reason, to help us tell the story of these individuals, and they are definitely clues.
So in the chat, someone mentioned that they noticed the Dory Miller poster looks like he's wearing a medal. Perhaps he received some type of honor. I think we kind of mentioned that just a little bit just now. Also that both are standing, posing like proud men.
Yep.
And then we kind of talked a little bit too about this. Darren mentioned that they're both looking up, and that Nicole actually answered too, that the audience is also looking at as well. Kate mentions, I think it's interesting that the phrase on the Dory Miller poster is like someone saying it about him, which makes sense because I think he's being used probably as a model for recruitment. We also have Darren's doing a little bit of comparison between the two, and he says they both have scarves around their necks. And then finally, one other thing that's mentioned is the phrase on Leonard Crodog's poster is like a phrase that he is saying, taking ownership of his place within America.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all really wonderful observations. With the Dory Miller poster, it was an inspirational poster that was created in 1943, again, just a few months after Dory Miller was awarded the Navy Cross, to showcase African Americans' contribution to World War II. And then with Leonard Crodog, this idea of we are still here, this particular poster was an advertisement for a documentary that was created in 1977. So again, posters have a very specific purpose, and it is really wonderful that we have so many of them in our collection that we can use, because they do allow us to look at a very specific moment in time, where I think other portraits, we see really a broader idea of time, but here it is a specific moment. So if we can move on to the next.
One last thing I'll mention too.
Yes.
Sorry,
No, it's
Barbara
okay.
mentioned the color choice of the background is just spot on. Their dark complexions are able to pop.
Yes, and that's why colors winds up being my number one rule when it comes to analyzing posters, because everything that I've read is very often poster artists will stick to our primary colors. So if you look at Leonard Crodog, it is red, yellow, and blue. And then with Dory Miller, it's very simple colors, right? We've got brown, we've got black, we have white, and then we have different tones of blue. So they keep it simple, very simple for a reason. Again, your eye is meant to draw into the color. All right, for our last one, we aren't going to spend a whole lot of time here because I want to get to the last few slides so you know where to go for resources related to the portrait gallery. But I did just want to point out a strategy that we really like to use a lot. And for this, I've taken us out of the 20th and the 21st century, and I've put us into the 19th century with these two wonderful portraits of John Brown. And so when you compare and contrast, the idea is you're thinking about all of the similarities and differences that you see between these two objects. But the other thing that compare and contrast allows you to do in the classroom is it allows you to think about one person's life and use the portraits as bookends to an era that you're studying. So here we have this great portrait of John Brown, which is considered to be the earliest known likeness, the photograph, the daguerreotype on the left. And it was created in 1846, 1847. And then compare it to John Brown, which dates from 1872. And it's important to note here that Brown was hanged in 1859. And so this portrait is what we call a memory portrait. So you're seeing an image, a painting that was created from another likeness of Brown. Brown obviously did not sit for this portrait. So when we're thinking about these intervening years from 1846 to really 1859, we can think about all that Brown is doing as it relates to abolishing slavery, everything that happened in Kansas and then at Harper's Ferry. So it winds up being a great way to think about someone's chronology. Two other great portraits to use are two portraits of Abraham Lincoln, perhaps at the beginning of his presidency and at the end of his presidency, because we can really think about the toll that the war took on Lincoln and how he aged via taking a look at portraits of him. So if you can move to the next slide. We took a look at, I think, 4 or 5 different close-looking strategies, but these are other strategies that we like to use at the Portrait Gallery. 7 ways to look at an artwork, 30-second look. We love to jump into portraits and to think about your 5 senses. And it's a wonderful way to start off a conversation at a portrait because there is no right or wrong answer. It is the student's entree into an image, and it allows them to think creatively, yes, about the portrait before moving on to the biography and the history. And then finally, a puzzle activity, a printed out copy of a portrait and cut it up and have students consider a small piece of a portrait before looking at the greater whole. And then finally, here's that link that I referred to at the very beginning to take a look and learn more about Harvard's artful thinking routines via their Project Zero site. So on to the next slide. In our final few minutes, I want to take you through a few different web resources. And Ashley, feel free to jump in at any point when we get to Learning Lab. So the Struggle for Justice, while it is an exhibition that is on view in the Portrait Gallery, it's one of our permanent exhibitions. We also do have a web exhibition related to the Struggle for Justice. While all of the portraits that we highlighted today are not necessarily in this web exhibition, you do have access to all of them via the Learning Lab collection that I'll show you at the end of our session. So if we move on to the next slide, I want to highlight really quickly, if you were struck by what we did today, the Portrait Gallery holds 2 summer teacher institutes every summer. The first one is the last week in June, and the second is the second week in July. Both institutes are the same, and when you apply for one. But it allows teachers to take a deep dive into our collection and to spend 4 days with curators and educators and historians, learning about our collection and how you can use it in the classroom. We've focused today on how portraits can be used when we're thinking about struggle for justice and in our social studies classroom, but there are such great ties to English language arts, to science, even to math. So I would encourage you, if you are interested, to get on our website and learn more about our Teacher Institute. And on to the next slide. These are additional resources on our website. So we have tried over the past few years to digitize most of our collection. And so our collection now is about 25,000 portraits strong. We highlighted about 6 or 7 today. So we're just scratching the surface. So I would encourage you to get on the website. You can search by an individual. You can see all the portraits that we have related to that individual. We also have a number of classroom resources that we highlight, including our Reading Portraiture Guide for Educators, which will also be on the Learning Lab collection. And my goal is always to grow this classroom resources page to keep including more and more resources related to our collection. And on to the next. So there are 3 pages up here. One is a link to my profile on Learning Lab. You can see the collections that I've created, and all the collections that I've created have been related to specific looking strategies. So compare and contrast, the 30-second look, the puzzle activity. So if you're interested in those strategies, you can get on my profile and see how I've used them and see what portraits I think work really well with them. In addition to that, within Learning Lab, if you search under NPG Teach or National Portrait Gallery, over the past couple of years that we've been using, that we've had teachers in our summer teacher institutes create Learning Lab collections, they have tagged their collections with NPG Teach or made sure to include National Portrait Gallery. So you can see what other teachers have created in relation to our collection as well.
I definitely encourage folks to check out all of those collections, because those are not only Briana's wonderful collections where she gives you kind of some tips on which portraits to maybe start with if you're kind of a little apprehensive about doing some of these strategies and leading these strategies by yourself. She's given you a number of different portraits to be able to start with. But then additionally, also searching for NPG Teach, you'll find from the summer institutes that just happened this past summer in 2016, so many innovative ways of using portraiture in the classroom. Everything from, a math lesson that was using geometry to compare and contrast of, Cassatt and Katy Perry. And so just some really interesting ways of using portraiture in the classroom that are done by peers, teachers like yourself. So certainly encourage you to check that out.
And last but not least, we created a collection based on today's Google Hangout. So all of the images that we used can be found here. And then I believe the archived Google Hangout will also be placed within this Learning Lab collection as well. And then finally, for all of you, if there's ever anything that you need, please feel free to get in contact with me if you have any questions about teacher programs, if you have any questions about resources or portraits in our collection. You have my phone number and my email. I try and be really good about responding to teachers, so do let me know if you need anything.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Briana, for all of your wonderful suggestions and tips on how to use portraiture in the classroom, especially for some of those social studies teachers out there who may be new to using museum resources. As we kind of close for the rest of the day, I wanted to remind folks that the Learning Lab collection that we just mentioned is listed within the description of the YouTube video. So you can take a peek there and check out all of those portraits, maybe zoom in on some of the details you missed in our webinar. And then also, like Briana mentioned, this Google Hangout will be archived. So same link, it'll be archived there for replay. And we'll also throw that into the Learning Lab collection that we just mentioned. Thank you so much to our participants. It was a fun, engaging hangout, and we look forward to seeing what you create next in the Learning Lab.
Thank you.